The officer's mistake. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the quiet suburban street. It was one of those afternoons where even the asphalt seemed to shimmer under the heat, and the only movement came from the slow hum of passing cars and the occasional rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Officer Jake Callahan, a seasoned cop with over a decade on the force, adjusted his belt and exhaled sharply as he leaned against his patrol car. Another slow day, another uneventful shift. That was until he spotted a black SUV parked slightly off the curb in front of a neat brick house. His instincts, honed from years of patrolling, told him something was off. The driver, a middle-aged black man in a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, stood by the trunk, seemingly waiting for someone. He was relaxed, too much so for Jake's liking. Jake didn't think of himself as a bad cop. No, he was just doing his job. And in his experience, a car parked at an odd angle, an unfamiliar man standing by it in a quiet neighborhood, well, that warranted a closer look. He adjusted his badge, squared his shoulders, and approached. "Afternoon, sir. Is there a problem here?" The man turned his head, meeting Jake's gaze with a calm confidence that immediately unsettled him. His eyes were sharp, observant, and carried a weight that Jake couldn't quite place. "No problem at all, officer," the man replied smoothly. His voice was deep and measured. "Just grabbing a few things from my car." Jake's gaze flicked to the black briefcase sitting beside the open trunk. It was sturdy, locked, and looked expensive. Something about it piqued his curiosity. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Jake asked, resting a hand on his holster out of habit. The man's lips curved into a slight smile. "Yes, actually. I do mind." Jake frowned. That wasn't the response he was expecting. Most people got nervous, flustered, or defensive when confronted by an officer. But this guy, he was calm. Too calm. "Sir, I need to know what's in that case, and I need to get on with my day," the man replied evenly. "Unless I'm under arrest, I'd like to be on my way." Jake felt something hot flare in his chest. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who looked so sure of himself. "Step aside," Jake ordered, reaching for the case. The man sighed, shaking his head slightly but said nothing. He simply stepped back, crossing his arms. Jake didn't waste another second. He popped the latch on the case, ready to uncover whatever it was that this man wanted to keep hidden. The moment he lifted the lid, a pressurized burst of red paint exploded out, hitting him directly in the face. For a second, Jake was too stunned to react. The thick, sticky liquid dripped down his cheeks, soaked into his uniform, and trickled onto his boots. The scent of paint filled his nostrils as his vision blurred red. He stumbled backward, wiping at his face in a panic. He could hear laughter, deep, rich, and unbothered. Blinking furiously, Jake turned towards the man, rage burning under his skin. What the hell was that? The man simply shook his head, his laughter tapering into a smirk. "That," he said, nodding at the dripping case, "was a security measure. You shouldn't have opened it." Jake's fists clenched, humiliation coursing through him. He could already hear the snickers from passersby who had witnessed the spectacle. "You," Jake started, but before he could finish, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a military ID. Jake's stomach dropped. The name on the card read, General Nathaniel Carter, U.S. Navy, retired. Jake's breath hitched. A Navy general. He had just violated the personal property of a decorated military officer. His mind raced, but Nathaniel Carter simply tilted his head, watching him carefully. "You assumed, officer," Carter said, his voice devoid of anger but full of unspoken lessons. "And now look at you, covered in red." Jake swallowed hard, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. A lesson in humility. Officer Jake Callahan stood frozen, his uniform soaked in bright red paint, his face burning with humiliation and disbelief. The once quiet street was now filled with murmurs and hushed laughter from onlookers. A few people had even pulled out their phones, recording the spectacle, a cop dripping with paint like a rookie who had just tripped over his own authority. His hands trembled with frustration as he wiped the thick liquid from his eyes. But no matter how much he tried, the stinging red glare remained in his vision. He could feel it seeping into his pores, his badge, his pride. Across from him, General Nathaniel Carter stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Unlike the spectators, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't mocking. He simply watched, waiting. Jake, still trying to regain control, sucked in a sharp breath. His training kicked in. De-escalate. Regain authority. Take back control. He squared his shoulders. "Sir, I need to ask you." Nathaniel raised a single hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His demeanor hadn't changed, but something in his stance, calm, powerful, unwavering, commanded instant silence. "You need to do nothing right now except take a good, hard look at yourself," Nathaniel said evenly. "You were so sure you had me figured out, so sure that you had the right to dig through something that didn't belong to you. And now, here we are." Jake bristled. "With all due respect, General, I was just doing my job." Nathaniel arched an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly is your job, Officer Callahan? To serve, to protect, or to assume?" The question hit like a slap. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of authority like this. He had dealt with difficult civilians, smart-mouthed lawyers, and even angry protesters. But a calm, calculated, and disappointed black military officer. This was new. Nathaniel sighed and gestured to the case, the same one that had just blasted Jake in the face with red paint. "Do you know what's inside this?" Nathaniel asked. Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "No. Of course, you don't." Nathaniel's voice was almost amused, but there was something deeper there. Something heavier. "You didn't ask. You didn't consider that maybe this case wasn't something suspicious. You just saw me. A black man with a locked briefcase, and your instincts told you it was trouble." Jake stiffened. "That's not fair." Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. "Isn't it?" The tension between them was thick enough to choke on. Jake's cheeks burned, but not just from anger anymore. Guilt gnawed at his chest, twisting and tightening. Nathaniel crouched down and wiped some of the still dripping red paint off the corner of the briefcase with his fingertips. He held it up, letting the sun catch the wet streaks before turning it toward Jake. "Do you know why this paint is here?" Jake swallowed hard. "To ruin my day." For the first time, Nathaniel let out a low chuckle. "Not quite. It's a security measure. A lesson I learned from years in the Navy. You don't just open something without knowing what's inside. And you sure as hell don't assume ownership over something that's not yours." Jake glanced away, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. "This case holds something important," he continued. "Inside are documents, medals, and letters from soldiers I've served with, some who didn't make it back home. It also holds a personal letter from my father, a man who fought in Vietnam before coming home to a country that barely acknowledged his service. And yet, all you saw was a black man standing on a street with a locked case, and that was enough for you to step in like you had every right to pry." Jake clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to justify, to explain, but what was there to say? Nathaniel shook his head and stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. "And now you're standing here, covered in red, looking just as foolish as you acted." Jake exhaled sharply, staring at the paint dripping down his arms. He knew people were still watching, still recording. For the first time in years, he felt something he never expected. Small. Nathaniel adjusted his stance, his voice lowering slightly. "Tell me, officer, if I had been a white man in a suit standing here with this exact same case, would you have asked to open it?" Jake froze. The answer was immediate in his gut, but his pride refused to let it reach his lips. Nathaniel's silence dragged for a moment before he sighed. "I thought so." Jake wanted to tell him he was wrong. That it wasn't like that. That his instincts weren't about race, that it was just a cop's intuition. But the truth was heavier than his excuses. Because deep down, he knew the truth. If the situation had been different, if Nathaniel Carter had been wearing an expensive suit, if his skin had been lighter, if his demeanor had been different, Jake wouldn't have opened the case. And that realization sat in his stomach like a lead weight. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then finally broke eye contact. He grabbed the handle of his briefcase, still dripping with paint, and began to walk away. But before he did, he turned over his shoulder and gave Jake one last look. "This paint," he said, his voice calm, yet sharp enough to cut. "It'll wash off." Then his gaze hardened. "But the stain of this moment, you'll carry that for a long time." And with that, he walked away. Jake stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding, his uniform dripping in red. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could ever feel clean again. The weight of consequence. Officer Jake Callahan remained rooted to the spot, his uniform still soaked in thick red paint. He could hear the murmur of voices around him, the occasional chuckle from bystanders, and the telltale sound of cell phone cameras clicking. His face burned, not just from the humiliation, but from something deeper, something unfamiliar. For years, he had walked the streets with a sense of authority, a belief that he was in control, that his badge gave him the right to act as a gatekeeper of justice. But now, standing there, stained and exposed, he felt none of that power. Instead, he felt naked. The words of General Nathaniel Carter echoed in his head. "Would you have done the same if I were a white man in a suit?" Jake knew the answer, and he hated it. As the heat of embarrassment twisted inside him, the police radio on his shoulder crackled. "Callahan, report back to the station immediately." The voice belonged to Captain Monroe, his commanding officer. Jake clenched his fists, took a slow breath, and forced himself to walk back to his patrol car. But even as he moved, the weight of what had just happened hung over him like a storm cloud. The walk of shame. As Jake stepped into the precinct, the station fell into an unnatural silence. Officers turned to look at him, their eyes widening at the sight of the red-stained uniform. Some of them exchanged glances, others stifled laughs, and a few simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. "Well," a voice broke the silence. "Looks like someone had a rough day." Jake turned to see Officer Brad Carter, one of his colleagues, smirking from his desk. "What happened, Callahan? Did you get into a fight with a can of spray paint?" More chuckles followed, but Jake didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply walked past them, head down, straight toward Captain Monroe's office. Facing the captain, Jake knocked once, then stepped inside. Captain Monroe sat behind his desk, his expression a mix of disappointment and exhaustion. A large TV screen was mounted on the wall, showing a paused frame of a viral video. Jake already knew what it was. The video of him getting sprayed with red paint, standing dumbfounded while Nathaniel Carter calmly walked away. The headline underneath read, "Rookie cop gets a reality check after harassing black military general." Jake winced. The video had already spread. It was out of his hands now. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jake, what the hell happened out there?" Jake swallowed hard, searching for the right words. It wasn't. He stopped himself. He had been about to say, it wasn't what it looked like, but even now, he wasn't sure if that was true. Monroe leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We're getting calls from the mayor's office, from community leaders, from the press. Everyone wants to know why one of my officers thought it was necessary to search a decorated Navy general's personal belongings like he was some kind of criminal." Jake's stomach tightened. You were just what, Callahan?" Monroe snapped. "Doing your job. Tell me, when did your job description include racial profiling?" Jake flinched. "I wasn't profiling," he said quickly. "I was following my instincts. The case looked suspicious." Monroe shook his head. "You mean he looked suspicious?" Jake felt a sharp pain in his chest. That's not fair, isn't it? Monroe's voice was low, steady, and cutting. If that man had been white, in a business suit, standing outside a BMW, would you have reacted the same way? Jake opened his mouth, then shut it, because deep down, he knew the answer. And so did Monroe. The captain sighed and leaned back in his chair. You screwed up, Jake, and not just a little. Jake tensed. Am I getting suspended? Monroe tapped his fingers against the desk, watching him. You think suspension is your biggest problem right now. Jake's heart sank further. Monroe continued. The video is out. People are pissed. And now Nathaniel Carter himself is filing a formal complaint with the department. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Nathaniel Carter, the same man he had wronged, wasn't just letting this go. A meeting with the general. Monroe took a deep breath, then said something that made Jake's blood run cold. You're going to meet with him. Jake blinked. What? Monroe nodded. General Carter has agreed to a private meeting with you before he decides on further action. Jake clenched his jaw. And what exactly am I supposed to say? Monroe's eyes narrowed. You're supposed to listen. Jake looked away, his mind racing. He had spent years in this uniform believing that he was one of the good guys, that he upheld justice. But today had forced him to ask a harder question. Was he really so different from the ones he claimed to be better than? Monroe leaned forward. This is a defining moment, Callahan. You can either double down on your mistakes, or you can learn from them. Jake exhaled slowly. When is the meeting? Tomorrow morning, Monroe said. And trust me, Callahan, you better be ready for it. Jake nodded stiffly, then stood up. But as he turned to leave, Monroe spoke one last time. Do you know why he had red paint in that case? Jake stopped in his tracks. Monroe gave him a long look. You should ask him. Jake hesitated, then stepped out of the office, his mind flooded with questions. Tomorrow morning, he would come face to face with General Nathaniel Carter once again. And this time, there would be no badge, no authority, and no excuses to hide behind. The truth behind the paint. Officer Jake Callahan stood outside the cafe where his meeting with General Nathaniel Carter was set to take place. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on him, his viral humiliation, the outrage from the public. And now, this meeting that felt less like a conversation and more like a reckoning. He wasn't sure what scared him more, facing Carter or facing the truth about himself. A tense arrival. Jake stepped inside. The cafe was a small, quiet spot on the edge of town. Nothing flashy, nothing fancy. Just real, honest, and unpretentious. A stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. At a corner table, Nathaniel Carter sat, calm and unreadable. He was dressed in a navy blue button-up shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his posture upright with the kind of composure that only a man who had been through wars, both on the battlefield and in society, could possess. Jake hesitated before making his way over. As soon as Carter looked up and locked eyes with him, Jake felt something strange. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was expectation. Like Carter was waiting to see if Jake would sink or swim. The conversation begins. Jake pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The silence between them was heavy, stretching out as Carter sipped his coffee without saying a word. Jake cleared his throat. Sir. Carter placed his cup down gently. Officer Callahan. Jake shifted in his seat. I just wanted to say. Carter raised a hand, stopping him. Before you start, I need to ask you something. Jake froze. Okay. Carter leaned forward slightly. Why did you think I was a threat? Jake opened his mouth, then closed it. That was the question, wasn't it? He thought back to the moment when he had pulled over Carter, to the way his eyes had locked onto that case in the backseat, to the gut feeling that told him something was off. And suddenly, he knew. He hadn't seen the case as a threat. He had seen the man holding it as one. Carter could tell the moment realization hit. He nodded. You see it now, don't you? Jake swallowed hard. Yeah. Carter exhaled through his nose, nodding again, as if he had seen this moment play out 100 times before. Tell me something, he continued. If that case had been in the hands of a white businessman instead of a black veteran in a t-shirt, would you have jumped to the same conclusion? Jake's stomach twisted. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that his instincts would have been the same. But he knew it wasn't true. Carter watched him closely. This isn't just about you, Officer Callahan. It's about the system that shaped you. The one that taught you to see a man like me as dangerous before you even knew my name. Jake clenched his fists under the table. It wasn't easy, facing this. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be easy. The truth about the case. Jake took a deep breath. I need to ask you something too. Carter raised an eyebrow. Jake hesitated, then said, Why did you have red paint in that case? For the first time, Carter smiled. Not a mocking smile, not an arrogant one, but a knowing one. He leaned back in his chair. You ever heard of the Buffalo Soldiers? Jake frowned. Yeah. The all-black regiments that served in the U.S. Army after the Civil War. Carter nodded. My great-grandfather was one of them. He fought harder than most, not just because he was a soldier, but because he was a black soldier in a country that refused to see him as an equal. Jake listened in silence. My family keeps a lot of historical artifacts. Carter continued. That case, it held a piece of history, a Medal of Honor awarded posthumously to my great-grandfather after he had already given his life for a country that barely acknowledged him. The red paint, that was part of a restoration project I was working on. Jake's stomach dropped. He had assumed the worst. He had treated Carter like a criminal. And all the while, Carter had been carrying a piece of his family's legacy. A legacy that had been stained, disrespected, and disregarded, just like the man himself. A choice to make. Carter leaned forward again. Now tell me, Officer Callahan, what do you plan to do with what you've just learned? Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't know. Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. I can respect that. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He sighed. I was raised to believe that the police are supposed to protect people, that the law is supposed to be fair. But lately, I don't know if I believe that anymore. Carter gave a small, understanding nod. Belief isn't the same as truth, son. If you want the system to be better, you have to fight for it to be better. Otherwise, nothing changes. Jake sat with that for a long moment. The final test. Carter picked up his cup again, taking one last sip. Then he stood, pushing his chair back. Jake looked up at him. Are you still filing that complaint? Carter met his gaze. Haven't decided yet. Jake frowned. So why did you agree to meet with me? Carter smiled again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Because I wanted to see if you were worth saving, Officer Callahan. Jake felt those words hit deep. Carter grabbed his jacket and turned to leave. But before stepping out, he paused. Change starts with one person, he said over his shoulder. Make sure you decide which side of history you want to be on. And with that, he was gone. The aftermath. Jake sat there, staring at his coffee, his mind racing. Everything he had believed in, everything he had been taught, had been challenged in a way he never expected. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? The crossroads of justice. Officer Jake Callahan sat in his squad car, parked in a secluded lot near the river. The city skyline reflected off the rippling water, its lights shimmering like distant stars. But Jake wasn't looking at the view. He was staring at his hands, hands that had pulled over General Nathaniel Carter, hands that had unlatched the case, broken into a piece of history, and painted his own ignorance in red for the world to see. Hands that had upheld the law without understanding the weight of justice, the weight of a decision. He was off duty, But his mind refused to rest. The meeting with Carter had rattled him to his core. If you want the system to be better, you have to fight for it to be better. Carter's words echoed in his head, louder than the hum of the city beyond. What did that mean for him? What could he actually do? Resignation had crossed his mind. Step away from the badge. Let the system be someone else's problem. But then what? He'd be another guy who saw the problem and walked away from it. No. If there was any chance of making this right, he needed to stand in the fire and do something. The Internal Affairs Inquiry. The next morning, Jake walked into precinct headquarters, his heart pounding. He knew the complaint Carter had every right to file hadn't been submitted yet, but that didn't mean others weren't watching. As soon as he stepped into the locker room, the whispers started. That's the guy who got splattered all over the internet. Yeah, the one who messed with the wrong dude. Man, you think they'll can him? Jake ignored them. He changed into his uniform, squared his shoulders, and made his way to Captain Reynolds' office. Reynolds, a gruff veteran of the force with a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured for Jake to sit the moment he entered. "You know why you're here, Callahan?" the captain asked. Jake nodded. "Because I let my bias cloud my judgment. Because I assumed a man was a criminal when he was actually a hero." Reynolds' expression didn't change. "You're damn right." Jake braced himself. Was this where they handed him his walking papers? Instead, Reynolds folded his hands on the desk. "General Carter hasn't pressed charges. He hasn't even filed a complaint yet. But you and I both know this department is under a microscope right now. You embarrassed yourself. Worse, you embarrassed this precinct." Jake swallowed but didn't break eye contact. "I know," he admitted. Reynolds let out a long sigh. "So tell me, what do you want to do about it?" That was the moment. Jake knew it. This was his chance to walk away, to let the heat die down, and pretend this never happened. Or he could take responsibility and try to fix what was broken. "I want to do better," Jake said. "Not just for myself. For this department. For the people we swore to serve." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Big words. Got any action to back them up? Jake took a breath. "I want to talk to General Carter again. I want to learn." The captain was silent for a moment before nodding. "Then I suggest you get moving, officer, because the world is watching." A new mission. Jake left the office, determination in his step. He needed to find Carter. But Carter wasn't the kind of man you could just summon. Jake had to earn the right to face him again. So he did something he'd never done before. He went to a community meeting in a predominantly black neighborhood, one that was hosting a discussion on policing, justice, and accountability. He walked in, uniform and all, knowing he'd be unwelcome. Knowing he had to face the discomfort anyway. A room full of eyes. The moment he entered, conversations halted. Dozens of pairs of eyes locked onto him, mistrusting, wary, hostile. Jake felt it all. But instead of walking away, he sat down. At first, no one spoke to him. Then, a woman in her 50s, Miss Lorraine Jacobs, a longtime activist in the community, stood up and folded her arms. "Well," she said, her voice sharp, "look who decided to show up. You here for another traffic stop." Laughter rippled through the room, but there was no humor in it. Jake didn't flinch. "I'm here because I got it wrong," he said simply. "And I need to get it right." The room fell silent again. Carter was there, standing near the back, watching. Jake met his eyes, but the general said nothing. Instead, Miss Jacobs crossed her arms tighter. "And what exactly do you plan to do about that?" Jake took a breath. Listen. A hard conversation. For the next hour, he did just that. He sat there while people voiced their frustrations, their pain, their anger. He listened as parents talked about how they had to teach their kids how to survive interactions with police. He listened as teenagers talked about the fear that came with walking in certain neighborhoods. He listened as elders spoke about a lifetime of mistrust. Every word was a punch to the gut. But he didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He didn't run. At one point, Miss Jacobs leaned forward. "So tell me, Officer Callahan, what are you gonna do now that you see it? Now that you hear us?" Jake looked her in the eyes. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted. "But I do know this. I want to be part of the solution. And I'll keep showing up until I get it right." For the first time, Nathaniel Carter smiled. A test of character. After the meeting, Carter finally approached. "You survived," he said, amusement in his voice. Jake exhaled. "Barely." Carter studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. "This was my father's," he said. "He used to write down everything he learned about leadership, justice, and resilience. Thought you might need it." Jake took it with shaking hands. "Why are you helping me?" Carter's eyes darkened. "Because change doesn't happen unless people are willing to do the work." Then he added, "But if you fail me, Callahan, if you show me this was just talk." He stepped closer, his voice low but powerful. "I will make sure you never wear that badge again." Jake nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Carter smiled again, just slightly. "Good." And with that, the real journey began. Redemption or ruin. Officer Jake Callahan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the worn leather notebook General Nathaniel Carter had handed him. Its edges were frayed, its pages slightly yellowed, but within it, he knew, were lessons written by a man who had fought for justice before Jake was even born. Jake hadn't read a word yet, because once he opened it, he'd have to face the truth. The truth about the system he had sworn to uphold. The truth about himself. He ran a hand down his face. He had spent years enforcing the law, but had he ever truly sought justice? The choice. His phone buzzed. A text from Captain Reynolds. "Meet me at the station. Now." Jake exhaled, grabbed the notebook, and headed out. At the precinct, the air was thick with tension. Officers murmured and glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. Reynolds stood in his office, arms crossed. "You made quite the scene at that community meeting," Reynolds said. "And now the higher-ups are watching you." Jake's stomach tightened. "You have two options, Callahan," Reynolds continued. "You can let this blow over, keep your head down, do your job. Or you can double down on whatever crusade this is and take whatever comes with it." Jake knew what that meant. If he kept pushing for change, he could lose his career. But if he stayed silent, he would lose himself. He looked at Reynolds and said, "I want to make this right." The captain sighed. "Then let's see if you have the guts to follow through." The last test. Jake's newfound commitment was about to be tested. The very next day, he was paired with Officer Brad Tully, one of the most vocal critics of his so-called redemption tour. "You got a bleeding heart now, Callahan," Tully sneered as they climbed into the squad car. "Gonna start handing out apology cards instead of citations." Jake ignored him. They got a call, a disturbance at a local convenience store. When they arrived, Jake saw a familiar sight, a young black man, hands up, fear in his eyes, and a store owner yelling accusations. Tully moved first, aggressive, hand on his holster. Jake stepped in front of him. "Let's slow down," Jake said, voice firm. "Let's hear his side." Tully glared at him. "Since when do we negotiate with thieves?" Jake ignored him and turned to the young man. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated. "Darren." Jake kept his hands open, non-threatening. "What happened, Darren?" The store owner, a middle-aged man with flaring nostrils, cut in. "He was loitering. I told him to leave, and he started mouthing off." Darren's jaw clenched. "I was waiting for my grandma. She was inside buying groceries. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Jake studied him. "Did you take anything?" "No, sir." Jake turned to the store owner. "Did you see him steal anything?" The man hesitated. "Well, no. But kids like him." Jake held up a hand. "Kids like him What? The store owner's mouth snapped shut. Jake took a deep breath, then looked at Tully. "We don't arrest people for standing outside a store," Jake said. "Let's get the facts before we treat someone like a criminal." Tully's face darkened. "You're getting soft, Callahan." Jake's jaw tightened. "No, I'm getting better." Tully scoffed, but didn't argue. The moment passed. Darren's grandmother came out, confirmed his story, and they left. No handcuffs, no trauma, just de-escalation. A call from the general. That night, Jake's phone rang. Nathaniel Carter. Jake picked up. "I heard what happened at the store," Carter said. Jake was stunned. "How? You think we don't watch what you do?" Carter chuckled. "The real test of character isn't what you say at meetings. It's what you do when no one's watching." Jake swallowed. "I just did what was right." Carter was silent for a moment, then said, "Then maybe there's hope for you yet. A future rewritten." Jake wasn't naive. He knew one good action wouldn't erase the past. He knew change was slow, painful, and full of resistance. But he also knew he had a choice every day to do better, to be better. And this time, he wouldn't turn away. This time, he would stand on the right side of history.